On the rugged west coast of Southland lays the tiny settlement of Orepuki. First established during the gold rushes of the 1860s, Orepuki boomed in the early 20th century thanks to forestry, agriculture and the shale oil industry. The bustling township once boasted a population of more than 1,200 people. The streets are quieter these days, but if you know where to look, there are still some powerful and poignant reminders of the past. For many locals, the most visible link is the Orepuki Memorial Gates, next to the old school. From 1930 until the school closed in 2003, this imposing brick monument was a part of everyday life for generations of Orepuki schoolchildren. As the years rolled on and the generations that knew these men disappeared, the personal connections faded too. Now, with the mass digitization of military records and newspapers, we can gain a small glimpse of the men on the Orepuki Memorial Gates. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, many young men from around Orepuki rushed to enlist in a patriotic fever. This war, they thought, would be over by Christmas and would be another great adventure, just like the Boer War 15 years earlier. As the combined New Zealand and Australian forces sailed towards Europe, the Ottoman Turkish Empire joined the Germans.
Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, conceived the idea of attacking Germany's ally Turkey through the Dardanelles. The whole plan of storming the Dardanelles with naval power was a complete failure. It only served to warn the Turks of further attacks.
The Australians and New Zealand infantry landed at Anzac Cove on the 25th of April 1915. Early advances were quickly stalled by determined Turkish counterattacks. After less than a week on Gallipoli, the situation was growing perilous. The Anzac lines were exposed and dangerously close to being overrun. On the 2nd of May, orders were given for the Otago Battalion, including the 200 men of the 8th Southern Company, to seize an exposed ridge near Pope's Hill. The attack was to be launched at 7:15 p.m, but the Otago Battalion was an hour late. Without artillery support, the Otagos advanced. The Southlanders on the right were tasked with charging up an exposed ridge into waiting machine guns. Within a few short minutes, only 40 of the company survived unwounded. The ridge was strewn with bodies of young Southlanders and was from then on known as Dead Man's Ridge. That night, Orepuki, Colac Bay and Pahia lost 6 men killed. They were Frank Forrester Adamson, 23, born in Pahia; Joseph Butler, 24. He grew up in Orepuki and was working as a bushman near Tuatapere. 21-year-old Edward Dutton, born in Winton and moved to Colac Bay as a young man. Sergeant John Gilman, 22. John was born in Invercargill and moved to Colac Bay to work as a grocer. Corporal Charles Griffith, 28. Charles was born to a farming family in Orepuki. Private Donald McPhee, 27. Don was born in Dunedin and moved with his family to Colac Bay. With the Gallipoli campaign turning into a deadly stalemate, local casualties continued to pile up. Gordon Haining, 22, son of the former Roundhill publican. Charles Hurst, 21, grandson of Orepuki's founding father Henry Hurst. In the cramped and unsanitary conditions of Anzac, sickness was often just as deadly an enemy as bullets. 21-year-old Waihoaka-born Cyril Bateman contracted typhoid fever and died in July. Albert Collinson, 23, a former bushman from Colac Bay, came down with pneumonia and died in November. Albert was the last local death from that terrible campaign.
After nearly 8 months, without let-up and without gain, the mutilated units silently, skillfully departed from Gallipoli. The whole murderous, useless operation cost 2,721 New Zealand lives. and 4,752 wounded, some of whom died later.
The exhausted New Zealanders briefly returned to Europe before embarking for the Western Front. They spent the first half of 1916 training with new techniques and equipment. The New Zealanders were stationed in a quiet sector, but casualties still mounted up due to trench raids and artillery fire. The first local death of 1916 was former Orepuki teacher Lieutenant Norman Hall, 23. The next death was another officer and the oldest man on the memorial, 40-year-old Lieutenant Simon Cooper. Simon was born at the Marukang at Wakapatu, and before the war worked for New Zealand Pine and was a lieutenant in the Territorials. James Whipp, 22. Orepuki-born James was working round Southland as an agricultural contractor. He too served at Gallipoli and was killed in action on the 4th of August 1916. 17 of the names on the Memorial Gates date from September and October 1916 during the battles of the Somme. 0 hour, 15th of September. The New Zealanders attack at dawn at Fleurs, supported by 4 slow-moving tanks and a creeping artillery barrage. They achieved their objectives, but casualties were horrific. In just 2 days fighting, the New Zealanders lost 600 dead, including 8 sons of Orepuki. 26-year-old William Henderson, born in Rimu and grew up in Orepuki. Orepuki-born William McDowell, 22. Percival Whelan, born in Roxburgh and grew up on his family farm near Frence's Point. Reginald Ward, 25. Reginald was working as a farmer around Orepuki. 21-year-old Henry Westbury was brought up on his family farm in Waihoaka. Sergeant John Given was 30 when he was killed on the 16th of September. Alfred Butler, 27. Alfred was born in Orepuki but was serving with the Canterbury Regiment when he was killed. Francis Cosgrove, 28, born and raised in Orepuki. Francis was a former wagon driver that enlisted with the Veterinarian Corps when the war broke out. He spent 1915 looking after horses in Egypt, but seems to have longed to serve at the front. During the attack on Fleurs, his comrades recalled he was the first seen charging out of the trench. He was never seen again. On the 25th of September 1916, the New Zealand Rifle Brigade was ordered to renew the offensive with a dawn assault. They took their objectives but suffered terrible casualties. Locally, former Pahia dairy factory worker George Taylor died of wounds received on that day. He was just 23 years old. Further attacks 2 days later were halted by uncut wire, machine guns and artillery. Local casualties included 27-year-old Sergeant Albert Newton. Albert grew up and worked in his family farm at Orepuki. John Riddle. John came from a pioneer Pāhi family and was 30 years old. John Wallace, 22, was born in Riverton and brought up in Orepuki. Before the war, he was a fireman for New Zealand Rail. On the 10th of October, the New Zealanders were withdrawn from the front line. The casualties for 2.5 months in combat were staggering. 8,000 Kiwis killed or wounded, roughly equal to the entire Gallipoli campaign. But even in the relative safety away from the front line, casualties still mounted. 25-year-old Robert Cosgrove, former blacksmith at Orepuki and brother of Francis Cosgrove, died of wounds on the 29th of October. Charles Bennett, 32. Charles was the son of pioneer Orepuki settlers and was killed in action on the 15th of November. Percy Johnson, 20 years old. The son of Scottish parents, Percy grew up in Orepuki and was working as a carrier before the war. After the horrors of the Somme, the New Zealanders returned to Flanders for the winter months. June 1917, the Battle of Messines. The New Zealanders were tasked with capturing the village of Messines. The attack was commenced with several massive mines being detonated under German positions. The infantry rushed forward and swept through enemy lines in just 16 minutes. The New Zealanders then pushed out further to establish a defensive line in which they held until they were relieved on the 10th of June. Even though the battle was seen as a success, 700 New Zealanders died in just 3 days. The next local death was actually after the main battle had ended. Charles Fisher, 26, was born at the Māori Kaika at Wakapatu and worked at Colac Bay. Charles was serving with the Māori Pioneer Battalion when he was killed on the 18th of June. The New Zealanders were kept busy consolidating their lines. On the 1st of October, William Brown from Orepuki was killed by a shell burst. William's comrades buried what was left of his body in a shell hole near the front. He was just 23 years old. A few days later, the third battle for Ypres began in earnest. The New Zealanders attacked again. While they were successful, 1,700 New Zealanders were killed or wounded. Colac Bay-born Richard Cook, 26, died of wounds received that day. 12th of October, the infamous Battle of Passchendaele. The New Zealanders were ordered to assault the Bellevue Spur. It was a disaster. The men struggled through mud, artillery and machine gun fire to find uncut wire and untouched pillboxes. The New Zealanders didn't take any of the objectives that day, but lost 800 men dead. The local men in the Southern Company were in the centre of the assault wave and suffered heavily. Tall and quietly spoken, Edward Fitzgerald was born and educated in Orepuki and worked on his family farm. He was 24 years old. 31-year-old Corporal John McLeod was a former schoolteacher in Orepuki. Archibald McPherson Wakefield, 22. Archibald was a former cheesemaker that lived in the district. The battered New Zealand infantry were withdrawn on the 18th of October, but the artillery had to stay a little longer. It was then that 21-year-old William Teal, a driver in the New Zealand Field Artillery, was killed. As with Gallipoli, sickness was an ever-present threat to the troops at the front. George Fletcher, the most decorated soldier on the memorial, was a former teacher at Orepuki. He was awarded the Military Medal for Gallantry and survived several big offensives before contracting and succumbing to meningitis on the 29th of October, 1917. As the battles died down, the New Zealanders consolidated their lines for the harsh winter ahead. Even though there were no large battles, men were still lost to artillery fire and small-scale trench raids. Former sawmiller, 22-year-old Clifford Collinson, lived for a time in Orepuki. In an effort to improve the New Zealand position, on the 3rd of December, the Otago and Canterbury battalions were ordered to attack positions near the Polder Hoek Chateau. In an attempt to surprise the Germans, they attacked in the middle of the day and without artillery. Needless to say, it didn't work, and on that day, 80 young men from the South Island lost their lives. Tihaka-born Reginald Laurie was just a week away from his 25th birthday. 21-year-old Albert Garden, grandson of Alexander Garden, after whom Garden Bay in Pahia is named, was a third-generation farmer from Pahia. William Meagher, 29. William moved to Orepuki with his parents in 1899 and worked at the Orepuki post office. March 1918. The Germans attempted their final spring offensive. Concentrated German forces forced the Allies back 60 kilometres in places. In desperation, the British threw up a last line of defence and rushed the New Zealanders in to plug up the gap. Here the Kiwis held the line against determined attacks from April to June. Irish-born John Linton emigrated to Orepuki with his brother in 1913. He was just 27 years old. Tasmanian-born Sergeant Henry Turner, 33, was an Orepuki-based labourer. He joined as a private in the infantry, but soon transferred to the machine gun corps. Irish-born Moses McBride emigrated to Pahia to be close to his sister and work as a farmhand. He joined his unit at the front just 2 weeks before he was killed. He was 28 years old. The exhausted New Zealanders were relieved in early June. With the German army demoralised, the Allies went in on the attack. Some of the New Zealand mounted rifles were attached to the French troops attacking and took part in the Second Battle of the Marne on the 18th of July. Round Hill-born Francis Butler was one of these men. He had survived a back wound at Passchendaele only to be killed on the 18th of July. On the 24th of August, the New Zealanders again took a leading role in the attack, this time well supported by tanks, to capture villages and strategic points. The fighting ended in victory, but it took its toll on the local officers. Second Lieutenant James Straw, 33. James grew up in Orepuki. His father Michael was the mine manager at the Orepuki Shale Works. 28-year-old Lieutenant Jack Watson of Pahia. Jack worked on his father's farm and as a cheesemaker before he enlisted. As the Allied advance gained momentum from September to October, the New Zealanders were repeatedly involved in smaller battles. One of these, the Battle for Canal du Nord in early October, claimed the life of rifleman Ronald Powell. Ronald was born in Queenstown and grew up in Orepuki. A week later, the New Zealanders continued the attack on German positions near the village of Esney. They captured 1,000 prisoners and 12 field guns, but took 800 casualties, including 150 dead. 2 local men were killed in this battle. Corporal Charles Dixon, 25, from Colac Bay, and Lance Corporal Ernest Laurie of Tihaka. Ernest was the oldest and the last of the Laurie brothers that were killed during the war. The New Zealanders continued their pursuit through the rest of October and into the final days of the war. The final action of our troops in November was the liberation of an ancient fortress town. The last local name from the First World War is that of 24-year-old Ewing Riddle. Ewing served with the New Zealand Light Mortar Battery. He was killed as the New Zealanders scaled the war on the 4th of November 1918. The war ended just a week later. "20 years after the Great War, trouble sparked up in Europe once more, and once again the citizens of Orepuki and districts answered the call to serve. The memorial gates reflect this human toll. Flying officer Spencer Dillon grew up in Pahia. Like many other New Zealand pilots during the war, he flew with the RAF in Europe and was killed in action flying bombers over Germany in August 1943. Orepuki born and raised George Henderson worked as a dairy factory assistant in Orepuki. He served with the infantry and was one of around 200 New Zealanders captured during fierce fighting in Libya in 1941. As a POW, he was marched onto an Italian ship heading back to Italy. A British submarine, not realising there were POWs on board, torpedoed and sunk the ship. Around 500 prisoners were killed, including 45 New Zealanders. Jack Linton was the son of Irish immigrants. He grew up on a farm in Orepuki and was a truck driver in Tuatapere before the war. Jack was killed in action on the 27th of November 1941 in the desert. He was 26 years old.